Brexit. Why it was doomed from the start. Hello, this is Sonny Bostock from Politicomment, and today I'm going to be talking about one of the most controversial decisions in British political history. Brexit. I will be breaking this video down into three parts. The first part will be going over a history of the UK and the EU. The second part will be talking about factors of how we managed to leave the EU, and the third part will be talking about the effects after Brexit. I hope you enjoy this video. So on screen now I've got some definitions which I won't go over, but if at any point you see a word that you don't understand and it's underlined, you can come back to this part in the video and look at the definitions. So here's the first page of definitions. And here's the second page of definitions. If at any point you do not understand something in this video, come back to this point and look at what the words mean. So let's begin by discussing Britain's shaky history in the European Union. So we first joined the European Economic Committee in 1973. We've been rejected twice by France because they believed that we were too close to the USA, we'd be a quote Trojan horse for the USA, and that we were too detached from Europe. This all stemmed from the Suez Crisis in 1956, where the USA told the UK and France to get out of the Suez Canal. The UK chose to go closer to the USA after this, and France chose to go closer to Europe, hence why they vetoed our joining application twice. In 1975, we held a referendum about staying in the EEC, just to see if the British people wanted it, and 66% voted to remain. In 1983, the Labour Party were defeated by the Conservatives after running on a Leave EEC platform. It is important to note that leaving the EEC is not the reason Labour lost the 1983 general election. Their manifesto was literally called the longest note in history. The Labour Party were in complete disarray, but they were running on a Leave EEC platform and did lose the election. Now in 1988, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher delivers her Bruges speech, and this begins Conservative Party Euroscepticism, because she warned that she believed the European Union, at this point still the EEC, would eventually form a European superstate that would heavily restrict the market, heavily restricts member states' sovereignty, and become a federation rather than a group of nations. She described wanting Europe to work as a group of happy friends rather than being under one umbrella. This defined the Conservative Party's stance on Europe for the next few decades. In 1989, the European Commission President, Jacques Delors, promised to implement workers' rights for member states in the EU, and this switched Labour to a pro-EU stance. They originally saw the EEC as a rich man's club. They thought it was for rich people, it would only benefit rich people, and workers would get none of it. But after President Jacques Delors promised to implement workers' rights, Labour switched their minds and became pro-EU. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty establishes the European Union. It had two criteria for joining the EU. That was using the EU's currency, which is now the euro, and implementing workers' rights into your country, which was called the Social Chapter. Conservative Prime Minister John Major negotiated with the EU, and the UK opted out of both of these, so we didn't implement the euro and we didn't implement workers' rights, because everyone in John Major's Conservative Party believed this was a step to a European superstate that Margaret Thatcher warned about in the Bruges speech. In 1997, the new Labour government are elected, and Chancellor Gordon Brown does 5 tests to see if the UK is economically ready to join the EU single currency. The 5 tests failed, and they were never designed to work. They were always designed to fail because joining the euro was a deeply unpopular stance to hold. So these 5 tests essentially ruled out joining the euro ever. In 2010, the Liberal Conservative coalition is elected. In 2011, the UK passed the European Union Act, which declared that if the EU wanted to hold any more power over the United Kingdom, they would have to hold a referendum. in the UK to see if that's what their citizens wanted. In 2013, Farage's United Kingdom Independence Party was rising, and Euroscepticism and huge anti-EU blocs were forming in the Conservative Party. The Tory party were becoming completely ungovernable, and many feared Conservative MPs flocking towards UKIP. David Cameron, to prevent this, promised to hold a referendum to leave the EU if the Conservative Party won the 2015 general election. He had to do this because he could not govern his own party. In 2015, the Conservatives win the general election, and as promised, hold a referendum. In 2016, this referendum is held, and Leave won with 51.9% of the vote compared to 48.1% of people voting to remain. A very narrow margin. In 2017, the new Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, triggered EU Article 50, beginning a 2-year legal withdrawal process. Article 50 outlines the rules for member states to voluntarily leave the European Union if they please. In 2018, the United Kingdom and the European Union agreed on a deal that, most notably, would prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and a hard border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. A hard border is essentially having to show your passport and go through lots of citizenship checks to go into that country. However, because Theresa May had called a snap general election in 2017 to try and increase her majority in Parliament, she actually ended up losing her majority and thus could not get this deal passed because all the opposing parties voted against her. She tried to pass it 3 times, and by 2019 it had been rejected 3 times. Theresa May resigns and the UK gets another new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He negotiates his own deal, and to prevent Parliament from blocking it, he lies to the Queen and tells her to prorogue, which means temporarily shut down, Parliament so that they cannot block his Brexit deal. He did not tell her this was the reason he wanted her to prorogue Parliament. He just told her to do it and said it was nothing to do with his EU deal. This was a lie, and lying to the monarch is illegal. The Prime Minister broke the law, and it wouldn't be the last time. On the 31st of January 2020, the United Kingdom leaves the EU under Boris Johnson's deal, and on the 1st of January 2021, the United Kingdom leaves the European Union's single market. To prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, Great Britain now has trade restrictions with Northern Ireland, so we cannot trade with our own country for free. We have trade restrictions. So now, let's talk about how, even though in 1975 we voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU, how in 2016 did we vote to leave the EU? Well, I've broken this down into short, medium and long-term factors, and each of the factors are on the screen for you to look at now. Let's start off with short-term factors. So the first short-term factor I'd like to talk about is related directly to the Brexit referendum election, specifically the voter turnout. So as you can see here on the screen, we've got how different age groups voted. So 18 to 24 year olds voted overwhelmingly to remain, so did 25 to 34 year olds. 35 to 44 year olds were closer but still voted majority to remain, and then 45 to 54 more voted leave, same with 55 to 64 and 65 plus voted leave. So you've got the youngest 3 age groups voting to remain and the oldest 3 age groups voting to leave. Now if you look at this, you might see that gap there is much bigger than that gap there. So how did we leave? Well, let's talk about voter turnout. So here you can see on the screen a graph that shows the turnout of different age groups. And as you'll see, 35% of people aged 18 to 24 did not vote. So it doesn't matter how big this is, when 35% of people didn't turn out to vote compared to 10% of 65 plus year olds who didn't vote. However, some studies argue that maybe if only 10% of 18 to 24 year olds didn't vote, it might result in a 50-50 outcome. However, this relies on the fact of 18 to 24 year olds voting exactly the same if more of them had voted, whereas it is entirely possible that if 90% of all 18 to 24 year olds did vote, they could have all voted Remain. It's impossible to tell. But younger people not coming out to vote in the election definitely had an effect on the outcome. To what extent is unknown, but it had an effect. There is also the case of media bias, specifically the British Broadcasting Company. So the BBC have to remain politically impartial because they're funded by the taxpayer. So in an attempt to remain impartial, the BBC employed a very specific tactic when discussing Brexit. If ever they broadcasted someone advocating to remain, no matter how factual this person was, they would always then broadcast someone advocating to leave, even if their arguments were factually incorrect. They broadcast them with the same screen time and the same weight as the person who advocated to remain, and this worked both ways. Whether this was an intentional bias or not is irrelevant. They did not properly or accurately report on the known and predicted effects of Brexit, and this confused voters, making them a lot more likely to vote leave, whereas if they'd had the actual information presented to them by the BBC, they might have voted remain. And I've got some specific examples in case you don't believe me. On the 20th of June 2016, 10 Nobel Prize winning economists published a paper warning about the negative economic impacts of Brexit. BBC reported this, that's fine. However, to balance this, the BBC used one quote from one economist and gave it the exact same amount of weight and airtime as 10 Nobel Prize winning economists. The BBC were claiming that one economist was just as right as 10 Nobel winning economists. Another example, the BBC's chief political advisor Rick Bailey appeared on Radio 4 and he directly stated that the Brexiteer claim of providing £350 million per week to the NHS could not be justified. He directly said there was no evidence for it. He was then rightfully asked how viewers of the BBC would know this. He didn't publish this information, he simply just referred to a Radio 4 programme which gets significantly less viewership than the BBC. The BBC knew this information. The chief political advisor of the BBC knew that the NHS would not be getting £350 million a week, and they did not publish it. They purposely withheld this information because they were scared it wasn't impartial. Impartiality is not balancing the views of two opposing political beliefs. It's sticking to the facts and nothing more. The BBC did not do this. They knew the facts, they knew the negative effects of Brexit, they didn't publish it. Whether that is an intentional bias or not is completely irrelevant. They ignored the facts, and they directly contributed to Leave winning the 2016 referendum. And now we'll move on to medium-term factors. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the immigration catalyst. Because the European Union has open border policies, which means citizens of EU member states can travel to other EU member states freely without having to show a passport or go through immigration checks or anything. Because of this, it was very easy for anti-migration politicians and public figures to claim that Brexit would help the UK take control of their borders. It was on a plate for them. They could just say, if we leave the open borders policy, we can control our borders. There was no evidence behind it, but it was a very easy claim. A good example would be Dominic Cummings' famous Take Back Control slogan. And as I'm saying, it's a much snappier thing to say, just to say, we'll take back control of our borders. It's very easy and very quick to say, and it resonates with people, whereas people who were arguing Remain actually had evidence and facts and statistics. They could back it up, but people aren't as interested in listening to complex analysis of why something won't work when they've got someone else just saying, this can take back control of our borders. That will resonate a lot more. And what I'm saying can be proved. The fact that people just voted for it because it sounded nice rather than it being based in reality is evidence through the fact that immigration rose after Brexit. That proves there was no evidence behind taking back control of our borders. Immigration rose after Brexit. People were sold a dream. Now we're going to move on to lies of pro-Brexit politicians, and I've got three main ones here. Two of them you've already heard me talk about. The £350 million a week, take back control, and this is a direct quote from a known Leave advocate. Absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market. Let's break down these lies. So let's start with £350 million a week for the NHS. This lie started when Gisela Stewart, who is the co-chair of the Vote Leave campaign, said, "We send £350 million per week to Brussels. I'd much rather spend it on the NHS." To start with, that figure's not true. We didn't send £350 million a week to Brussels. That's a lie. The true figure was closer to £161 million, and furthermore, phrasing it as we send £350 million per week to Brussels makes it sound like we received nothing in return from the EU, which was false. We got access to the single market, to open travel without restrictions, to cheaper goods, to mutual defence, and so much more. The money we sent wasn't just for fun, it directly contributed to the United Kingdom being a better, safer, more stable country. And politicians spread this lie everywhere. Boris Johnson had it printed on a bus. The £350 million per week for the NHS was such a huge lie that was spread everywhere by pro-Brexit politicians and public figures. And guess what? It was not true. Since Brexit, the required funding for the NHS has risen rapidly, and £161 million per week does not even begin to cover what the NHS needs. And not that it went anywhere near the NHS anyway. For example, in 2019, and this is before COVID, so COVID is having no effect on this, in 2019, NHS required funding rose by £400 million per week. And because of COVID, this would have risen much further after 2020 and 2021. Even if we were saving £350 million a week, it wouldn't have even covered the pre-COVID NHS funding requirements. This was a complete lie, not based in reality. It was just something short and snappy that people could say to get votes. Now let's talk about the Take Back Control slogan. It was popularised by Dominic Cummings, who was the chief strategist of the Vote Leave campaign. He argued that Brexit would help Britain take back control of our sovereignty and our borders. It was a lie. Let's start with why it was a lie about taking back control of sovereignty. Leave campaigners lied to voters and made them believe that the United Kingdom had no say in laws passed by the EU. This is demonstrably false. It's a lie. British citizens were able to vote for members of the European Parliament, MEPs, of which key figures like Nigel Farage was one. He was an MEP, and he managed to convince people that we had no say in the European Parliament as a member of the European Parliament. It was a lie. And furthermore, most laws passed by the EU that we had to follow were completely mundane or just objectively good laws. They made laws on flammable materials for flags, so you can't use flammable materials. They made data protection and privacy laws, such as the GDPR, and they protected workers' rights. These are so mundane and boring, or objectively good laws, that we had a say in, but why does it even matter? Look at some of those laws. We were not being negatively affected by the European Union Parliament. It was a lie. Our sovereignty wasn't being curved by the EU in any meaningful way. And now let's look at the take back control of our borders lie. Leave campaigners claimed that leaving the EU would help the United Kingdom control and decrease immigration because we would not be subject to their open borders. This is a lie. Immigration rose post-Brexit. Notably the amount of asylum seekers. And there's a very specific reason why we now get more asylum seekers than we did in the EU. This is because, whilst being an EU member state, we were subject to the Dublin regulation, which stated that asylum seekers must claim asylum in the first country they arrive in. For example, if there was an asylum seeker from Palestine who's trying to escape the war, and the first country they landed in was Italy, but they travelled to the UK could legally send them back to Italy and make them claim asylum in Italy as it was the first country they landed in. However, if an asylum seeker did that now, we would have no legal basis to send them back to Italy. They would legally be allowed to claim asylum in the United Kingdom, and this is what is happening a lot. And finally, here's the biggest barefaced lie of the Brexit campaign. Many pro-Brexit figures, such as Daniel Hannan, Owen Paterson and Boris Johnson, claimed during the lead-up to the referendum that the UK would not leave the EU single market. So businesses who relied on importing goods from the EU tax-free, as well as fishers, farmers and other tradespeople who relied on exporting their goods to the EU, gained confidence because, we're not going to leave the single market, they won't have to pay anymore, their business won't be affected. January 2017, Prime Minister Theresa May stated the UK cannot possibly remain in the EU single market. Now, unlike the 350 million or the take back control, this isn't just a misleading claim. When pro-Brexit campaigners were claiming that we would not leave the EU single market, this was a barefaced, undefendable lie. They said we wouldn't leave the EU single market. We left the EU single market. It was a complete, indefensible lie to voters. They lied to the people of the United Kingdom. And finally, some long-term factors that led to Leave winning the Brexit referendum. So first I want to talk about left behind areas. Left behind areas is a term that refers to areas that were no longer able to attract businesses after the Industrial Revolution, such as Barnsley, Blackpool and Middlesbrough. They boomed in the Industrial Revolution, but after the industrial period ended, they were not able to attract businesses to their towns or cities. And because they couldn't attract businesses, this led to economic deprivation, which led to lack of education, which led to a lack of opportunities in a country that was globalising and booming. They were not able to get the jobs that people who were well educated, because they weren't in a left behind area, were. And because of this, they believed that voting for Brexit would help make Britain self-sufficient and give them increased opportunities. They also believed it would act as a protest vote against the country that ignored them and marginalised them for years. Some people in left behind areas genuinely thought Brexit would help them. Some wanted to stick it to the country that had ignored them for decades. Let's talk about the education divide. Countless studies demonstrate that the higher your level of education, so by higher education we mean people who've gone to university, if you have gone to university you are more likely to vote liberally or left wing. And if you have not gone to university, so you've dropped out of school after GCSEs or after college, you are more likely to vote conservatively or right wing. In the context of Brexit, voting Remain was strongly positively correlated with level of education. And because of economic downturn and increasing lack of opportunities within the UK, the education divide is greater than ever, and an increasing number of people go directly into work or apprenticeships simply because university is just unaffordable for them. And so, because less people received graduate level education, more people voted leave. And finally, identity politics. The Brexit referendum acted as another proxy for the culture war. Those who viewed themselves as social conservatives or nationalist instantly attached themselves to the label of Leave, whereas those who saw themselves as liberal began supporting Remain. They didn't educate themselves on it, they didn't look into it any further. They heard people say that Remain is what liberals voted and Leave is what conservatives voted. And because of this, they voted that. They didn't care about the pros and cons of Brexit. They saw a label, they attached it to their identity, and they voted whichever label they were given. And identity politics has been happening for decades. And it's still happening today in British politics, where people are becoming rapidly polarised. People who see themselves as nationalists instantly go to Reform. People who see themselves as left-wing instantly go to the Green Party or Labour. They don't weigh up the options. They see a party, they attach it to their identity, and you can't change their minds. This effect is best seen in America with Democrats and Republicans. 10 years after the Brexit referendum, half a decade after we officially left the EU. Where are we now? Where is our economy after Brexit? Well, let's talk numbers. The numbers you are currently seeing on the screen I got from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and these numbers are from November 2025. The UK's GDP, which is the country's wealth, per capita, which is per person, so the country's wealth divided by our population, is estimated at 6.8% lower than it would have been without Brexit. Now, as single digits, 6 to 8% poorer doesn't sound that much, but the current UK GDP per capita is £40,591. If it hadn't been 7% lower, that number would have gone to £43,432. Each family would have been about £3,500 better off on average if Brexit had not happened. Investment is estimated at 12 to 18% lower. Employment is 3 to 4% lower, so hundreds of thousands of people have lost jobs because of Brexit, and productivity is 3 to 4% lower. Economists had predicted a 4% long-term GDP loss, but it happened in 5 years. We lost 4% of our GDP in 5 years. And here are just some graphs showing you the effects. I'm sorry if it's a bit blurry, but this one, just look at the lines, they go downwards. Here's some more statistics for you from Aston Business School in September 2024. Goods exports are estimated to be up to 30% lower than they would have been without Brexit. There's been an estimated 27% decline in the value of UK exports to the EU and a 32% decline of UK imports from the EU. So we have lost £64.7 billion of exports and £117.6 billion of imports. The British Meat Processors Association reported a 50% drop in exports of certain meats in 2021, and there has been a 38% drop in textiles exports to the EU, which is detrimental as we exported 74% of textiles to the EU pre-Brexit. I'm sorry that was an information and statistic dump, but look at the numbers. This is empirical, numerical proof that our country, the economy, is worse off because of Brexit. Now let's talk about immigration. I don't have much to say for this one. Let the graph speak for itself. Here's Brexit, if you couldn't tell. That's when we left the EU. What do you notice? The graph is speaking for itself. We were told immigration would go down. Look at it. It was a complete lie. And let's look, have we got more sovereignty as a result of Brexit? Well, during the Brexit negotiations, the United Kingdom incorporated 6,925 pieces of EU legislation into UK law, and this became known as retained EU law. So we took laws from the EU and put them into our British law. Since we did that, 4,351 of these laws have remained entirely unchanged, 847 have been amended, 1,597 have been repealed, and the remaining have been replaced, expired, or are still being decided. Does that look like we gained more control of our sovereignty? All we did was incorporate 2/3 of EU law into British law. We didn't completely overhaul the legal basis of the EU, we just took it into British law. That's not being in control of sovereignty. And furthermore, most of the laws that were repealed were already obsolete by superseding laws. It doesn't matter that they were repealed because they already weren't in effect. Now, some laws that the UK has, such as a VAT tax on private schools or a ban on live animal exports, that wouldn't have been possible without the EU. So there have been some laws we're able to pass by leaving the EU, but overall, Brexit has had very little effect on UK sovereignty. And by the way, all this data is straight from gov.uk. This is government data. So let's conclude all of this. Overall, as you've just seen, the negative effects of Brexit are uncountable. And I say uncountable because I've taken a sample of 3 areas that Brexit is negatively affected. There are so many more areas. There's pharmaceutical, there's chemical, there's travel, there's monetary. So many negative effects have come from Brexit. And the United Kingdom is undeniably in a worse place than we would have been without Brexit. Now, studies indicate 63% of UK voters would now vote to rejoin the EU, indicating a strong feeling to reverse Brexit. Many Brexit politicians said, oh well, 51.9% of Britons voted to leave, so we have to do what they say. Well, now 63 want to rejoin. Why don't you have to do what they say? Some politicians, such as Wes Streeting, promised to work towards healing our relations with the EU. We need to rejoin the EU. Brexit was the biggest shooting of your own foot in British political history. To conclude, Brexit was an undeniable mistake forged through lie after lie after lie by politicians and Leave campaigners, and it is something that the United Kingdom would undeniably benefit from reversing. Thank you very, very, very much for watching the video all the way to the end. I know it's been a longer video, but this is a very in-depth and complex topic and I still haven't been able to manage to cover everything. I really do appreciate your support for watching this video. Thank you very much. Please go and support it on all my other social media platforms. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.